Welcome to The Authority File, the podcast where you'll hear conversations with academic librarians, technologists, researchers, and authors whose work is laying the foundation for higher education's future. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. If you're new to The Authority File, we encourage you to sign up for our monthly newsletter, The Authority File Roundup, which keeps you updated on previous, current, and upcoming Authority File episodes. You can subscribe at choice360.org by clicking on the newsletter banner at the top of the homepage. So here's a question for you. What is the function of a library? Given who's listening to this podcast, that might sound like a rhetorical question, but my guests for this series have published a new book called Unpacking the Personal Library, The Public and Private Life of Books, published by Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In it, they collect essays and stories that interrogate the meaning and purpose of a variety of libraries, like libraries at foreign embassies, or the personal libraries of authors, politicians, and poets. While doing so, we learn about the relationship between libraries and archives, how using digitized resources differs from wandering the stacks, and even what the value of libraries are to the great variety of individuals who curate them and visit them. Joining me are the co-editors of Unpacking the Personal Library, Jason Kamlott, Professor of English and Research Chair in Literature and Sound Studies at Concordia University, and Jeffrey Weingarten, Professor in the School of Language and Liberal Studies at Fanshawe College. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press. In this third episode, we take a deeper dive into Jason and Jeffrey's book and how, as it examines theories, practices, and philosophies of libraries, the academic library fits into their conclusions. So you've described your title as a quote, book about moments, what's happening with collections in the last decade and what's lost when libraries are discarding volumes because they have other copies of the same book, end quote. Jason, I'll jump over to you for this. Can you talk more about that statement?
Yeah, I think it's a continuation really of what Jeff's been talking about. I mean, I would just add one more sort of important distinction between digital collections and say, material collections, right? And this has become extremely evident to me through my work with Spoken Web, where we're moving from analog audiovisual media to digitizations of those. That the relationship between media format and form itself is really important for our encounter with these materials. So if you want to engage with and listen to a sound recording on a reel-to-reel machine versus having it as a digital file, there are great gains to the digitization, primarily being access, right? That suddenly these materials become accessible in ways that they aren't otherwise, because not everyone happens to have a reel-to-reel machine in their home to listen to these things, right? But there are also significant losses, right, in terms of understanding perhaps why something took its form as a result of the format that existed at the time to capture it. The example I would mention in particular are sort of the earliest adaptations. This is from my book Phonopoetics, which is about early sound recordings, right? But the earliest adaptations of novels to sound, right, were sort of subject to the affordances of sound recording preservation media at the time, which could hold about 3 to 5 minutes of sound. So how do you get a Dickens novel onto a 5-minute or 4-minute cylinder, right? So that's a very extreme version of the relationship between media format and form. But I think if we think of this in the broader sense of what's happening to our collections, and why libraries are discarding volumes, thinking of the Richler collection and why a library, like my university's special collections or library, was not willing to accept the Mordecai Richler library, right? In great part because it takes up a lot of space. So just to be clear, the Mordecai Richler library is being held in an English department space, right? Not in the library space. Mm-hmm. It's actually, there are archival quality materials, but they're, in locked cupboards that are really just in my English department, right? And the library couldn't couldn't take it, and nor could the Jewish Public Library in Montreal, the McGill University Library. None of the libraries in the city were willing to accept a personal library. One of the main arguments for this would be, we have most of the books already that Richler owned. These are trade copies, and these are duplicates. Why would we want to just acquire a bunch of duplicates and hold them somewhere else just because they belong to Mordecai Richler, right? That said, we began to explain sort of why it might be worth doing that, because there are traces of Richler on some of these duplicate copies that tell us other things, than the copies that are in the stacks at McGill or Concordia or at the Jewish Public Library in Montreal. And the other, and then the Victorianist in me, who's been, who's a long-standing member of the Research Society for Victorian Periodicals, for example, would say even, different print runs, different versions of a book, that may exist on the shelves can tell you very different things about a cultural moment, right? Victorian periodicals, for the most part, when they were, collected and bound and put on the shelves in libraries, had all of the advertisements at the back and the front stripped of them, for example. But if you do happen to have copies that have kept those, suddenly you have a whole window into Victorian culture that you wouldn't have if those weren't there. So different copies can sometimes be extremely valuable for telling you different things about a cultural situation. And then, beyond that, and this sometimes seems, people shouldn't write in their library books. If they borrow a book, don't write in it, don't highlight it, and don't use a pen, but people do, right? And over time, actually, the traces of readership that are manifest in the collections that are on the shelves is also a very interesting, a fascinating cultural resource. And so, Jeff mentioned Andy Stauffer's sort of project. The chapter in the book that he provides is related to a larger project called Book Traces, where he's actually very interested in finding traces of readership and use, in these copies, which if you basically decide to boil down a book to one digital copy that everyone has access to, you're losing kind of all of this other cultural information that could be extremely interesting and significant. Now, the question is it worth spending all the money on the space required to keep this variety of copies across the nation, for this kind of potentially negligible cultural information, that having that variety might provide? I think it's a very important question for libraries to consider, because they don't have endless budgets either, right? So it's a balancing act that I think we're in the middle of right now. But I do think it's important for librarians, and I think that librarians for the most part are very aware of this, to at least reflect upon the significance of redundancies in collections, because there may be more, as we were saying earlier, sort of intricacies, cultural intricacies within a particular object or particular version of a book than we perhaps first thought. A book isn't just the catalog record of the book. It's actually, it comes to have a life of its own once it circulates among people.
Yeah. Go ahead, Jeffrey.
Sorry, I was just going to add, Jason gives this really, really great, discussion of versioning, the idea that, the same publisher can release a book 10 times and each iteration of it will say something very different about the cultural moment. And for me, one of the examples I always found resonated with students was I think it's an early 60s copy. I haven't done this in about 10 years, so I might be fuzzy on details here. But if I recall, it's an early 60s copy of Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush, like a pivotal Canadian tale of settlement. And on the back blurb, it's described as like this classic that's about Canada and the frontier and this and that. No mention of Moody at all. And the book was heavily truncated by an editor who said in the introduction that people in the 60s don't want to read long books. And then the reissue from the same publisher in the 1980s, I believe, says that this is the story of one woman's survival and her effort to explore the wilderness and survive. And it becomes not about a Canadian concept, but a feminist concept of a woman settling, a woman surviving. And same publisher, two different versions, 20 years apart. And for obvious reasons, in that 20 years, a lot happened to change the framing of the book. And it's a really insightful change.
Yeah.
So just as a testament to what versioning can offer.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an excellent point. Jason, I'm curious, despite the fact that the collection is housed in your English department, I mean, had you been coordinating with the library or the librarians there on sort of managing the collection and maintaining it and indexing it and that kind of thing?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, when
Okay.
we acquired it, I work with librarians all the time. Spoken Web project, which has about 100 researchers associated with it. I'd say a good 30 to 40% of them are librarians and archivists. So it's a very
Mhm.
important part of my research in general. And for the Richler project, I didn't begin to catalog it without first actually consulting with several of my librarian colleagues here at Concordia. We came up with, essentially the cataloging model that we were going to use for this, for the books. In fact, with the books, it was quite easy. My colleagues said, well, you should get a scanner and let's download OCLC data for each of the books. And so we were using a database, and just essentially as much as possible for the books that had ISBNs, we were capturing, data from WorldCat. But as I said, there are literally thousands of other items in this collection. So we had to
Yeah.
come up with kind of two cataloging systems. One was for the books, to which we added extra fields, like I was saying, about the qualities of the actual material copy of the book. So in addition to the OCLC data that we had in there to, the cataloging, the Library of Congress subject headings and all that, we had extra fields that said fold on page 73 or annotation on, exactly. So we added these sort of more specific items about the books, but then we had to come up with a kind of archival descriptive structure for all of these other things. And probably in addition to that, and we sort of looked through, with my colleagues, we would look through a bunch of different systems, something closer to museum descriptions of objects as well, because there are a lot of material objects. There are 17 typewriters, for example, in the collection that we inherited, and there were lots of furniture, things
Yeah.
like that. So it was kind of a real mixture of sort of library cataloging, archival cataloging for a lot of the documents and papers, periodicals cataloging, and then sort of, you could say, museum type cataloging of actual things. And we had to sort of mash that all together to sort of somehow make it work for this, as I was calling it earlier, messy collection.
Right. That's great. So your book examines theories, practices, and philosophies of public and private libraries. And I'm curious, are you including academic libraries in the public kind of category? If not, where do you see academic libraries existing in this continuum? And Jeffrey, I'll just jump back to you on that.
Yeah, sure. And I think Jason will have a lot of value to add to this, since
Okay,
this is
great.
like his life.
All right,
but
great. Well,
but I'll say that when we talk about a private library becoming public, I mean, Jason's work shows, right, that can take many forms. It can be a dedicated space outside of an academic library. It could be one of the examples in our book is the Al Purdy A-frame home. It's his old cottage, the poet Al Purdy, and his library has been kept intact. And every year, writers stay there for a few weeks, a few months at a time, and do work. And one of them was Nick Bradley, who contributed a piece about Al Purdy to our book. But my first, I mean, to be honest, until we started working on this book, I don't think it had ever occurred to me that a library would end up somewhere other than an academic institution, because all of my experiences up until that point had been academic. My first experience with an academic institution that was holding onto a library was, again, Al Purdy, but it was a collection of his books that he donated to Laidlaw Library at the University of Toronto, and it was very publicly on display. And as a young undergraduate, I would go there and just go through to look at all of the books that Al owned and just think about, what was Al reading and when. And so the Al Purdy collection at Laidlaw, the last time I saw it anyway, which is 20 years ago, it was, an open shelf in the middle of the reading area that anyone could just kind of come up and take stuff off. I don't think you could take books out, but you could, use them as a reference book. Other authors, though, I mean, F.R. Scott, his books ended up in the rare books room where it was treated like an archive, separate. You have to make an appointment to go look at it. And, you have to be careful and catalog anything you touch or handle and so on. And then I went to a book sale and for $2 was buying books that had been owned at one point by Hugh MacLennan. So it all just kind of depends, how the academic institution or the academic handler interprets these books. I think what Jason's done is very unusual, and he deserves a lot of credit for managing to convince everyone to do it because it's amazing to have this dedicated space that doesn't just hold on to the books, but it holds on to the experience of being in a reading room that Richler would have himself inhabited.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think in most cases, the issue is that academic institutions, they don't know what to do with these collections. We don't have well-defined theories of what exactly is a private collection. Are they just inheriting books? Well, then you get rid of the duplicates, because if we're just inheriting books, we don't need 10 copies of this author's book, right? If we're treating them as a cultural archive, then you keep everyone's hands off of them and put them somewhere where no one will ever find them, you know? And, or are they something more like a monument or an homage to the owner? Well, then you do what Jason's doing, which is building this room that's meant to be publicly sort of perused and inhabited in order to kind of recreate the experience of being Richler and being at his desk and seeing his books.
Mm-hmm.
So I think definitional issues here kind of impede any kind of effort to say what exactly an academic institution would think about an inheritance like that.
Yeah, that's a good point, because as you were talking, I was thinking, oh man, this question that I asked you is sort of almost moot in a certain respect, because it's the minute you take one collection and put it into a different place, physical space, it automatically changes what it is. So yeah, Jason, obviously, I'm curious to see what you think about that.
Yeah, I'm interested to think about what we mean by academic libraries in the first place, right? I think so. University libraries. I think so. I've been in my department for over 20 years now, so I've seen colleagues retire who've built up significant libraries of their own, which we would call sort of their personal libraries. Although a lot of those books were bought with public money, because we get sort of professional development allowances that allow us to buy books over the years, right? Which come from the university. And it's interesting to see what happens to those books, because these are thousands of academic books. Like, those are little mini specialized academic libraries, you could say, along the lines of many of the earliest sort of personal libraries that were developed around specific areas of study that eventually made their way into university libraries. So a lot of the story that I tell in the introduction to this book is about how individuals' purposes of collecting, which may relate to specific academic or intellectual interests, represent some of the most important resources for the academic libraries to come, like Brown University or many of the big university libraries were built out of privately developed libraries in the first place. And so your question sort of counterintuitively got me thinking not about my university library, but about all the libraries that exist across the university in people's offices, and how there's actually no structure in place to do anything with those books after someone's deceased, and how very often, if a colleague retires, they basically say to the people they know, like I had a Victorianist colleague who retired a few years ago, and he said, come and choose whatever books you want. So suddenly I was like pulling, I probably ended up I don't have room in my office really for his whole library collection, but that's what I would have done if I could have, but I took like 50 books that I really wanted, and in part because it had his notes in them, like there are all kinds of reasons, right? But those books could be offered to our library, but of course they're not going to be taken, So there are those sort of mini personal academic libraries that exist across universities, all over the world. And then there are actual university libraries, which are designed not to have redundancies. They're very and interlibrary loan and consortia across libraries within a particular city are really about avoiding those kinds of redundancies. And I think that makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, as I was saying earlier, there are personal history is inherent even in academic libraries. So there are interesting things, and the academic library isn't just a source of sort of pure knowledge, based on you have this book and this book and this book, and that's what we need in order to cover that field, right? But they are cultural entities. They're fields of cultural interpretation in and of themselves, and they hold stories about that institution and about the wider cultures around the institution through the traces of use of those collections. So, but how far we want to go again in sort of imagining the importance of that aspect of our academic library collections is something to think about and debate, because it's expensive to keep every book that the library ever held in order to see if someone folded this page or that page.
Yeah, exactly. You just heard from Jason Camlott, Professor of English and Research Chair in Literature and Sound Studies at Concordia University, and Jeffrey Weingarten, Professor in the School of Language and Liberal Studies at Fanshawe College. Join us next week as Jason and Jeffrey share their key takeaways regarding the methods of collecting and curating various kinds of library holdings and how they think their book deals with the evolution of collection development. This series is brought to you with support from Wilfrid Laurier University Press.
The goals of institutions in building their libraries for coverage, to deliver materials that are necessary for research to proceed in certain ways is, for obvious reasons, the primary mandate that's governing the selection of books and the decisions they make over what books they have or not, and the costs of preserving sort of redundancies because they represented an assemblage that may be of cultural interest in relation to that individual's collection of things, is extremely valuable from my perspective, but also just not a cost that most institutions are able to afford right now.
As always, underwriting opportunities for the Authority File podcast are directed by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced and edited by Choice's digital media producer, Sabrina Kofer, with support from digital media assistant Ashley Roy. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.